When I first started using the Ricoh GR3 and GR3X along with my Fujifilm cameras, the transition wasn't really easy. Certain features that I relied on with Fujifilm, like the tilt screen and the aperture ring, were missing. It took some time for me to get accustomed to Ricoh's little quirks. But once I dialed in the settings to fit my shooting style and also adapted my shooting style to fit what works best with these cameras, I found that the system was highly adaptable, enough that I've captured some of my favorite images this year on the Ricoh GR3 and the GR3X. And today I'm going to share my configuration for this camera and how I shoot with it. But before I share exactly how I've got it set up, I wanted to take a moment to thank today's video sponsor, Squarespace. I've actually been using Squarespace for over 10 years. Their templates and easy to use interface make it incredibly simple to create and maintain a professional looking website without any coding experience necessary. My Squarespace website was an essential part of how I built my photography business. It allowed me to showcase my portfolio, share recent work on my blog, and also receive inquiries from potential clients through my contact form. If you're one of those photographers who are relying on your Instagram profile as the sole place to share your work and build your photography business, I'd really consider making a website on Squarespace. You can visit squarespace.com/ReggieBallesteros to start a free trial and get 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Thanks again to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. So I primarily use aperture priority because the manual controls on this camera didn't really feel right for my workflow. So when you're in manual, you can't actually set the ISO with just this like circled out. You have to press it down and then change the ISO. And I didn't really like that, so I switched over to aperture priority for how I particularly use this camera. This mode gives me enough creative control while also automating the ISO and the shutter speed. The key for me was, how do I set up the auto ISO to have banks similar to Fujifilm so that I have different minimum shutter speed banks? And then I could use the function button for exposure lock in conjunction with exposure compensation. The Ricoh only has one auto ISO setting for the minimum shutter speed, but I figured out a trick where I can mimic the different auto ISO modes from Fujifilm by using the U1, U2, and U3 as different minimum shutter speeds. So basically U1 here is my aperture priority that's set to a 1/125th of a second minimum shutter speed. And then U2 right here is the 1/160th of a second shutter speed. And then U3 is my 1/15th minimum shutter speed. And the way that I use these three different banks is U1, 1/125th of a second, is used primarily for outdoor shooting, and U2 is for still life or very low light scenarios where sharpness isn't critical, because 1/125th of a second is most critical for when you're documenting people even indoors. And U3, which is 1/15 of a second, that's used when I want to capture intentional motion blur, or when, I'm really at night and I don't care about if it's sharp and I just want to get the best low light capability of the camera. So I set the function button here, which on the Ricoh GR3 HDF, it's typically set to the HDF function, the highlight diffusion filter, but instead I use mine as exposure lock. So you'll see it right here. It has the auto exposure lock right there. That way I can use the auto exposure on and off in tandem with the exposure compensation dial. So basically I lock the exposure, adjust the compensation, and then keep it locked until I take photos, multiple photos if necessary, and then I unlock it. So if I was taking a picture of like this right here, what I would do is hit exposure lock, and then I can change around the composition right here, increase, decrease until I got it right, and then take the picture. Boom. Take another picture, and then I can unlock it and set it to 0 and then frame something different right here. So for this camera, I typically never put it into autofocus continuous. I typically rely on autofocus single, and I try to predict or pre-focus my shots, which is pretty much how I shot on Fujifilm 90% of the time. If the autofocus doesn't get the subject right, I just tap it, whatever place I need to, and then I get the focus, and then I recompose if necessary. Since the Ricoh has a 2.8 aperture, I'm pretty comfortable stopping down to give the focus a bit more margin, since I'm not really getting shallow depth of field anyways. As far as the shutter goes, I set this to have both autofocus and auto exposure lock. I don't mess with that back button type focus thing. So when it comes to the adjust dial, which is this one right here, this is basically once you click it down, you have a set of, 5 different quick menus that you use. The one that I have in the middle is the image control, and this allows me to switch between U1 and U2, which is where I have my recipes stored. So I have U1 is Reggie's color negative, and then U2 is Reggie's monotone standard. And I usually just switch between here. So if I'm shooting, shoot something, and then I go down, click the adjust, and go down, and I'm to my different film simulation recipe. I only use 2 across all my cameras, even on Fujifilm, just 1 color and 1 black and white. So it's not a big adjustment coming from Fujifilm system. And then to the right here, I have the auto exposure metering, which I typically shoot in multi-segment most of the time, but sometimes I will shoot in highlight weighted metering, which is basically taking the brightest part of the scene and exposing for that. And I do that on those kind of like high contrast scenes that you see my light and shadow play type photos. So I basically just go between these 2 right here. To the right of this is the outdoor view setting. I usually increase it to +1 when I go outside, just because this doesn't have a tilt screen or EVF, so you're going to combat the sun, the bright sunlight and the reflections on the screen sometimes. If I need to hold the camera like up in the air or super down low and I can't see it, that's where the +1 goes in. So I'm usually in +1, +2 sometimes, but then I'm usually shooting at the 0 one, which I actually have a different video on how I calibrate my screen for that 0 brightness level. And then on the right hand side is the focus mode. I usually have this default set to auto area autofocus with the center, so that I can just usually have something in the center and it'll get it, and then I can focus and recompose. And then the only other time that I'll change the autofocus is to the snap mode for something that is fast moving or unpredictable subjects. In this case, I'll set it to snap focus right here, and then if you go on this side, you can see the different ranges with this little green bar right here. So then if you change it to 0.3, you can see there's not a lot of leeway, but then if you go to like 5, you can see there's a big bar all the way from 3 meters to infinity. So that's kind of how you figure that out, that range out. You have to be in this snap mode in order to see this range, because if you just do the full press snap focus, which I was doing at first, it doesn't tell you the prediction of the distance, unfortunately. So I usually have this at like 1.5 or like 2 meters, just, once you're stopped down to f8, you have like this little usable range right here. Truth be told, I'm still learning zone focusing, so the depth perception, the prediction of how far things are, I'm still not really knowing, and I'm trying to practice on that. So this button right here, which is the video record button, I actually set this to the HDF toggle on and off. And because I have the HDF model, when I was using the standard ND one, I had this set to, I think, changing the film simulations, but in this case with the HDF, I set this to toggling it on HDF and then off. On and off. And this is basically using this so that I can turn on the highlight diffusion filter on or off depending on the scenario. I typically shoot with it on. I want to say like 95%, 99% of the photos I take with this camera, the Ricoh GR3X HDF, is always with the HDF filter on. But there are times that I turn it off, specifically if there's like my kids are in front of a window and they're getting backlit. I'll probably turn it off because it gets a little bit too glowy, but it's nice to be able to toggle it on and off if you need to. So now we go on to the 4-way controller, which is basically this one right here. You can set each thing different for different functions. I have this set to the standard macro for any type of close-up shots. It's easy, turn it on, turn it off. And then here for the right, I have the drive mode, which typically I set it to continuous shooting. Sometimes I'll change it to the multi-exposure mode. And then left is typically by default set to ISO. And I have this set to crop. So you can do the internal crop. So here I have a 50mm equivalent, 71mm equivalent, and then going back to the 40mm equivalent. So I think that's pretty cool to be able to do. Once you get on the 71, it's not a lot of megapixels, but since I shoot 100% JPEG, having this internal crop is cool because I can get the composition right in camera. And then the down is where I have the white balance. I typically have this set to auto white balance, but if I need to change it up, specifically if I'm shooting flash or anything like that, I have that set right there. This full setup really allows me to shoot more intuitively. I can shoot with just one hand. I can take the camera out of my pocket, hold it in one hand, adjust the aperture, the exposure compensation, all those things, get the composition right. Even when I'm holding my kid's hand with my left hand, I can shoot with the right hand. So it's pretty cool. And I feel like I've been able to make the most out of the Ricoh system while still staying true to kind of like a new workflow, a new evolved workflow for my creative needs, especially in this season of life when I have kids, I'm on the go, and I'm taking a lot of these photos basically just when I'm out and about, not on specific photo walks. If you want to see my go-to recipe for straight-up camera JPEGs on the Ricoh, be sure to check out these videos over here, and leave a comment down below if you want me to go through all my settings on this camera, like step by step. Let me know.